Well, hi. With me today is a friend of mine, Perry Young. Perry works in global banking in Asia, and we were talking about this over a number of cups of coffee together. And interestingly, I wanted to bring him in on the first sort of video associated with my security newsletters. And the reason that triggered that was the last blog I wrote was all triggered from my days at the London Stock Exchange. Well, guess what? Perry and I actually worked at the same damn building together, which I thought was really quite cool. And we both shared stories of the stock exchange in our relative journeys. I think the truth of it was I set it up and then Perry came in and fixed it. So thank you for looking after my earlier career errors. Let's get straight into it. We were discussing in great detail, and I have done a number of times, constraints. And cybersecurity, we're in this dreadful period of time where we're facing threats going up on an axis. We're affecting ourselves with our resource constraints and experience. And we're also sitting in a world right now with financial scrutiny over the top of us. Isn't this the time we're going to go into a new year? The time we start now saying we can do more with less and do it better. Tell me your position on that.
Absolutely we can. In fact, absolutely we must. I think the time of just buying security controls, capabilities to meet compliance requirements and trusting that silver bullet kind of mantra that you get from vendors, I think those times have gone. I think, taking Jeff Bezos's principles of frugality, etc., people want to actually, get something for their money and know that it's going to work at the end as well. I think cybersecurity is an optimal place to kind of play that out. It's something which is typically costs a lot of money. The effectiveness of cybersecurity investment often doesn't actually, realize real benefits. My strong feeling is that we can all focus on actually mitigating the real threats to an organization. And you don't have to spend money or excessive amounts of money to do that. If you really focus on what is likely to hit you, and then focus on the minimum viable countermeasures to mitigate those threats to your organization. If you do that, you can really start to save money as well as reduce your risk, buy down your risk, without spending excessive amounts of money on what I term whack-a-mole solutions, whack-a-mole security solutions, where you put those around the edge and you assume that it's going to defend you, and then the very next day you either get breached if you're really unlucky, or you might have some red team exercises or adversary emulation stuff going on, and that achieves the same outcome as well. So you've spent your money and you're not actually realizing the risk reduction.
That's interesting because it leads me to ask a very pointed question, Perry, which is, there's a fear, isn't there? When we use tools, we buy them because they give us, we think, and they do to some extent, visibility. And thus it is a very visceral feeling to then say, I'm not going to look as much. But I'd argue that on the one bucket, but then say we're missing so much because we are seeing too much. So there's a real challenge. Is how do we really drill into the fact that how do we need to determine our risk in a new way, and how do we ignore stuff like this?
Yeah, so what I'm not really saying, and what I'm not saying is don't spend on security technologies to protect your organization. What I'm actually saying is look at those, understand what specific threats, tactics, techniques, and procedures you're looking to mitigate, the things which are targeting your type of organization, and then see whether or not those particular security capabilities actually deliver on that. And so the way I would do that is I would map the specific tactics and techniques to the technologies, and then I might even include that in an RFP engagement with a vendor. You tell me what your defense actually protects against, and then I'll go and test it. And this is where I use my adversary emulation testing, my purple teaming, my internal penetration testing, etc. And I do that based on those tactics, techniques, and procedures against that security measure. Does it actually deliver on the outcome I think it's going to deliver against? And that's very powerful, because I can then go back to the vendor and say, well, you do on this one, this one, this one, and this one, but not on this one. So is there anything you can do to kind of fix that? Or is this a gap for you? But it also means that when I make a selection of technology, what I'm buying is something I know is going to deliver. And that helps me to measurably reduce the residual risk, because I know that my countermeasures deliver on the outcomes, and I can evidence that. I can provide a report. I can show the outcome from an actual test, an actual adversary emulation test.
You've done something that we don't hear about very much, which is it takes great resource to assess, number one, your posture and where you're at. It takes a great deal of experience and a team sometimes to be able to do that. It also takes time to put all the work in to do that requirements capture and the validation side. How do we deal with real data and so on and so forth? And then even when we do choose it, the one thing that's troubling me greatly at the moment, Perry, is vendors in cybersecurity used to be motivated to solve our problems with us. Now they're against their quarter end. Their motivations are often, I'm being very careful in what I say, often not in alignment with what we need in our orgs. And so, yes, you're validating against that and you're solving, you've come up with a hypothesis. I need to do this because of these reasons. And therefore I select my tools and I do my due diligence. But that's a vast piece of work to sweat that down, isn't it? And there's also a lot to do post deployment as well to keep on top of this. Tell me your thoughts on this.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me try and unpack some of that. Part of the difficulty is that these technology vendors are engaging with certain practitioners within an organization, and those practitioners sometimes don't even know. Not their fault, they're not in the right part of the business, but they don't know which threats are prevalent within their type of organization and how they manifest themselves. And trying to retrofit that over the top and try and understand those threats is a very difficult task, in fact impossible in some cases. So the vendors don't know what to address necessarily, because they don't necessarily understand the threats that are prevalent within an organization. So let me peel it back a little bit. Secure by design, and you've heard secure by default as well. These have been talked about for quite a number of years, but are they well implemented? Do many organizations really implement these methodologies? I think they don't, because I think they feel that they're complex, require a lot of resources, a lot of knowledge. It doesn't necessarily lead to compliance, and compliance is what drives a lot of organizations, etc. But I have a story around this on how to actually bake it in. And the real essence around this is to be proactive around assessing your infrastructure, your assets, your systems, and then to bake in the security evaluation, threat modeling at multiple levels at the technology engineering phase. But you can't just do that as a one-off hit. It's actually a continuous cycle that you must run, and you must bed that into your operations day in, day out. Why do you need to make it a continuous cycle? Well, the thing that you can depend upon within organizations is change. Change of technology, the threat landscape is ever changing. The risk to your organization is not a static thing. It's something that morphs from day to day. Your risk posture yesterday is not the same as it is today or tomorrow. So it's important to factor that into your security methodology. What you don't really want to be doing is reactively discovering vulnerabilities and weaknesses in your organization after you've deployed technology. That's when the threat actors have likely breached or have the ability to breach your environment. So to figure that out retrospectively is not optimal. What you really want to be able to do is look at vulnerability and weakness from the very, very beginning as much as you can, and then plug those holes and do it in the most effective, minimum viable way possible. And then you build that into a continuous cycle that is adaptive to changes. And of course, you need to be able to demonstrate that you're compliant with the various control frameworks that you're implementing within your organization. The mechanisms exist to basically map those tactics, techniques, and procedures and the weaknesses that you've discovered back to those control frameworks. You see, what I tend to do differently and look at differently, a lot of organizations start with the control frameworks. And rightly so, they have their regulators and things breathing down their necks. You must be compliant with this. NIST cybersecurity framework, ISO 27001, the new DORA regulations that are coming out in January in the EU. All of these things you have to be compliant with, right? But where I see there's a gap is people try and be compliant through checkboxes by implementing a technology. But those control frameworks are very one-size-fits-all. They're not very focused on an organization. So when it comes down to actually mitigating risk and addressing cyber threats, mitigating cyber threats, it never quite makes it through to the technology. At best, you might improve some detections. And you might determine,
Well, actually, on this note, you've just said something here, which is, so many of these things, they work, but they are, their application is very generic to so many organizations. Let's take, for example, Okta. Does it do what it says it does? Absolutely. But the way in which you can apply it can be so varied because it's designed to be able to implement to all sorts of orgs. And so we've seen it so many times with clients where it's not, did you deploy Okta and was that successful? The answer was absolutely yes. But did it implement the policies and the design of what you wanted to achieve in the first place? And where we found the problem was in the assumption that it did, and it did not. And that was a major thing because where we start fishing, biggest issue out there. And there's your gateway to it, or initial first, as an example, as a success to zone function. But the threat model found the fact that the implementation was not quite right for that org. It's not the vendor's fault, it's the way it's tuned and deployed for that use case, right?
Yeah, and I've got something else to say about that as well. From a vendor perspective, most technology vendors, I'm not talking about coding an application yourselves in-house. I'm talking about you go and procure a product. Yes. Let's just say, I'm from the network world, so let me focus on networks. You buy a network product, a router, a switch, load balancer. It will come pretty much with everything turned on. And you then need to determine what to turn off. And you may not turn things off. You may just configure the thing which you want to use.
Yes.
But then you may have a breach, and that breach could be the result of some feature that you're not using that gets exploited. The common one is web user interfaces. So a lot of people just leave those web user interfaces running. Not many organizations, especially large organizations, are using those. They might be using programmatic ways of deploying your configuration. But threat actors will exploit those because they're turned on. So I'm very keen on working with the vendors to have them take a kind of a least privilege approach, disable everything by default, and then allow people to turn on the features that they want. And I see this as an element of secure by default. Now, secure by default is something you can work with vendors to accomplish. But where you can't do that, that's when you need to focus on secure by design. So how are you going to model how you can exactly how are you going to you're going to look at your assets? You're going to look at weaknesses in an individual asset. How can someone exploit those weaknesses? But you can't quantify risk at an asset level. Here's another factor. So you need to look at the weaknesses, the vulnerabilities associated with the asset, and you may be looking at the techniques that exploit those vulnerabilities. But to get to risk, you need to understand the deployment use case of that asset. So this is where systems come into play. So I'll call it a system. My definition of a system will be a loose coupling of assets for a specific purpose. You might call it an application. You might call it a topology. It's a system. So when you have a system, you start to build the context that might give you the details of your impact. So for example, does this topology contain crown jewel, high privileged data, for example? Or is it a high value target that a threat actor might go after? And you start to build that kind of context that enables you to quantify risk around it.
So this is good though. So sorry to interrupt, but you're mentioning what we've discussed before, which is very much a threat-informed approach.
It is. It's totally based on a threat-informed defense approach. However, I look at it slightly differently. So when you mention threat-informed defense to a lot of folk, and this isn't wrong, they very much focus on cyber threat intelligence, and look at which threat actor is playing out which advanced persistent threat on which type of organization. And that's all totally valid and it's totally relevant. For me, I've come from the infrastructure world, and I see the gaps whereby this doesn't proliferate to the actual technologies in terms of implementing measures. It's very hit and miss. So the way I approach the threat modeling within my life cycle is I look at the asset level first. So I'm looking at weaknesses, vulnerabilities, and the MITRE tactics, for example, techniques that might exploit vulnerability and weakness at the asset level. But I don't care so much at that point around which threat actors might do something with that particular asset. I will later. Then I look at the assemblies, my patterns that I define. So I might start off in an organization that isn't defining patterns and templates for its designs. And really where it needs to evolve into is you define security patterns for your different topologies that comprise assets which have been threat modeled, and your security patterns get threat modeled. So let's just say I have security pattern version 1. If something changes, new threats emerge, some software changes, some component goes obsolete and I need to swap it out, that might make version 2 of my security pattern. And I will look at the delta and I'll see the holes and the weaknesses. But that's not all. This is where the third part of threat modeling comes into play. And this is the attack-centric threat modeling. So your cyber threat intelligence, you might be lucky enough, like banks are, to have internal cyber threat intelligence teams, and you might consume threat feeds and have intelligence, etc. You should know which attacks are relevant to your organization based on either what's happened before in the past. So you might have had some issues, some attacks that played out across your organization. So you've got some qualitative data there, or quantitative data, sorry. And then you look at the prevalence of certain attacks against your kind of industry or your industry vertical. Now, then you can drill down to certain attacks. Now, those attacks typically comprise of a flow of different techniques. So then you can overlay those attacks onto your estate of systems. So imagine I've determined that I have a weakness for a particular technique. It could be, I don't know, a lateral movement technique. And I might not have been able to mitigate that with a countermeasure. Is it relevant? Well, it might be relevant when I overlay the attacks on top of that. So you end up with, like, say, a MITRE attack flow for a relevant type of threat actor attack on your type of organization that does A for initial access, B for lateral movement, C for persistence, D for privilege escalation, etc. When you overlay that onto your technology, your assets and your systems that you've already threat modeled, you can see, do I still have a gap? Do I still have a hole that I need to mitigate? Or am I now defensible against that across my security patterns? So by looking at your assets first, understanding your asset inventory, understanding the security patterns that those assets form, and then overlaying attacks on top of that, you get a really powerful way to see where your gaps are, and impact fits into that as well. So you can basically look at proper risk quantification. Now, for me, you need to understand the threat, the vulnerability, the likelihood or prevalence, probability, and the impact to be able to do risk quantification. And what I find in a lot of organizations, technologists get asked, what is the risk of your asset? And yeah, I mean, they're not the right people. They don't necessarily know what the compliance risk might be, or the cost value of something to the business, or which threats are prevalent. So they only have a piece of the puzzle, so they guess. So the risk quantification is not very accurate at all. Whereas what I'm really pushing is a evidence-based way of doing risk quantification. So if you're looking at assets, you're looking at vulnerabilities, you've overlaid threat-based, attack-centric threat modeling data on top, and then you've mapped in your CIA triad, confidentiality, integrity, availability, to determine what your crown jewels are. You have the pieces of the puzzle to be able to know what your risk is, and to be able to provide evidence around where you are in mitigating that. So my cycle includes defining the assets and the systems. You might define maybe what is a crown jewel at that level as well, for the cyber resilience folks as well. They're very interested in that point. Modeling weaknesses. So weaknesses aren't necessarily known CVEs, thematic weakness. So it could be something that's not configured properly. That's a weakness as well.
Absolutely.
So in my model, I've got a simplified view of it. It's very super simplified. There's a lot to this. Secure by design can be quite complex, but I'm trying to demystify it and also explain why senior decision makers and stakeholders, why they should care about it, why they should go in this direction. So firstly, before I get onto that, the core elements are to know your assets and your systems. When I've done this in organizations, it's really helped because I found things that you find lots of obsolescence, lots of obsolete assets, or you might find lots of hygiene issues. Good example might be the same platform deployed across your organization may have 10 different versions of software running. So why is that? So you ask these questions and it helps you drill down to defining your lifecycle management properly, reducing the anomalies in your footprint and technology. So you get your inventory out of the way properly. So you need to build your inventory and it forces that. Mm-hmm. And then you look at weakness enumeration, and that's looking at CVEs. You could start with CVEs, it's a great place to start, especially the known exploited vulnerabilities. So CISA released CISA KEV, known exploited vulnerabilities. Great place to start. If you can only start somewhere, start there. But then the threat modeling comes into play here. So you're asset centric. If you know what your system's going to look like, you can do your system centric threat modeling, etc. And then threat enumeration. This is where, so I know my weaknesses, my vulnerabilities, the holes. I might have done some stride threat modeling, etc. But I need to then map to which tactics, techniques, and procedures are relevant to exploit those vulnerabilities. Mm-hmm. So I'm a heavy user of MITRE, but you could look at other threat frameworks as well, like OWASP and so on. At this point, it's important to build, say, a threat library where you have things like MITRE ATT&CK in there, MITRE Enterprise ATT&CK. You might have the ICS matrix if you're in an organization that runs OT, for example. Mm. You could be a manufacturing company. And also I focus on AI threats. I mean, it's very, very much the now. So there's another matrix like the MITRE Atlas matrix. You can slot that in there as well and look at those techniques and see how they align to vulnerability and weakness with your assets and your systems. So you can switch and swap. But as long as you enumerate the threats that exploit the vulnerabilities to cause impacts. And then when you know where those gaps are, okay, something you can do with those, right? You either change something about your design to avoid those threats, or you try and mitigate them, or you accept them if you can't mitigate them, right? So let's focus on mitigation. So this is where I look at the minimum viable way to mitigate your vulnerability to those threats. Mm. So there might be 5, 6, 7 different ways that you can skin that cat of mitigating those threats. Now, typically, there could be an easy way. An easy way might cost a lot of money. It might cost $1 million. Or you might be able to achieve the same outcome if you know which threats you're mitigating simply by making a change in the configuration. Disable a service, yes. Disable a port, that kind of thing.
On that note, actually, Perry, and I think this is super important. You've just hit a nub on this of a point. So many people accept a technology because it gives blanket coverage, which does these things. If you work the problem in a different way, you have the opportunity to think it through and say, what else can I do? And if you don't have $1 million in this use case, then we've got to think. And then we sweat the detail in a different way, right? Or we do both.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you do spend the money, well, why not spend the money on something you've checked out? So going back to what I said earlier, your RFP, you include your MITRE techniques in the RFP, which ones of these does your security solution mitigate? And then you've tested them. So you know that there's an effective measure. So if you're going to spend the money on a technology, you've mapped it, and you know that you're going to have an effective control. But if I'm just implementing a regular countermeasure, i.e. disabling a service,
Yes,
I'll dumb it down to that level. Well, then you need to validate the efficacy of that. So if I use something like MITRE ATT&CK, that's very helpful because, you know, the cyber threat intelligence people use MITRE ATT&CK as a common language to speak, common lexicon to speak across an organization. Your SOC, your detection folk, they use MITRE ATT&CK. Your red teams use MITRE ATT&CK. So why not use MITRE ATT&CK here to inform your countermeasures and then how to test them?
absolutely.
So when I implement a countermeasure, let me also say, I would look at across NIST, the identify, detect, protect, respond, and recover. I'm not just looking at prevention. I prefer to prevent something because if you can prevent it, problem goes away and you've reduced the risk. If you can't, you might want to improve your detections. But make my detections focused around techniques, not around indicators of compromise that threat actors can easily pivot around. They can easily change file hashes, for example. This is aligned to David Bianco's Pyramid of Pain, if anyone's heard of that. So yeah, TTP-based detection. So you build that in. I might also consider cyber resilience. Can I respond and recover should my asset or system be breached in a certain way? So that would be a countermeasure as well. And then I want to test all of that. So I'll test that with adversary emulation, which could be breach and attack simulation. There's a lot of tools out there right now that do that. I won't name any vendors. It's quite a few. Or you could leverage the concept of purple teaming here, or directed red teaming, whereby you test a specific technique. You can either do that as a chain, an attack flow, anatomic testing, or you can atomically test each individual technique. So if I'm mitigating a specific technique, I might get my purple team folks to basically test a particular technique. Can they breach it? Does it work? Does it not?
Love that. Love that. I use a very simple analogy, which is to take some beakers and you do A/B testing and see what the answer in C is. And then, you know, and stage them and go back to your point. Now, the thing you're putting us through here is it's a multi-dimensional thinking process because you're looking through the life cycle and say, if I can't prevent it, can I mitigate, detect, respond to it, etc. So very conscious of time here, Perry. So I know that you have some actionable takeaways.
Yeah, there's a couple of other things I just want to mention quickly as well, right? So just the compliance folk. So once you know your once you know which techniques exploit vulnerabilities within your assets or infrastructure, there are already mappings back to things like NIST 853. So you can backwards map to a control framework. And if I'm using, say, MITRE Atlas for AI, I could even map back to the NIST AI risk management framework, for example, switch and swap. Yeah, and you can bolt in different risk quantification models as well, different approaches that fit your organization. So this is a very adaptable type of method, but it's a continuous cycle.
So you're not constrained.
You're not constrained, right? So it's meant to be adaptable, but the main takeaways for senior stakeholders, senior decision makers, it's really around being able to effectively reduce risk with evidence-based mitigation. So I can provide the report that shows that I'm tangibly reducing the residual risk. And I have the evidence to justify that. And I'm justifying that I'm compliant as well because I'm mapping back to a control framework.
Yes.
But I've done it using the minimum viable set of countermeasures, which is a potentially a more cost-conscious approach to mitigating risk. Now, I might still spend some money on some vendors, but I'm spending the money wisely on the things that are going to mitigate the threats that are relevant to me, and only those. So,
and you're not bloating your feed, are you? The data that you have to absorb because you've got an over-bloated tool set that's not giving you the visibility to your point, what's important.
Yeah, and so it's driven by need. So you mitigate the things that you have a need to mitigate, rather than whack-a-mole approach, checkbox approach, which means you spend a lot of money and you may not even achieve any risk reduction outcomes because you don't really know what the risks are. So how can you know that you're going to mitigate the risks? You're spending a lot of money with no real evidential outcome. So this is a way of basically
high risk.
Exactly right. So a thing that comes up now, some of these approaches require good cybersecurity knowledge. They require good platform knowledge. My view around this is that it supports the need to have skilled cybersecurity SMEs in the workplace, but the cost of that effort is offset based on what you save in not having to spend so much on checkbox technology controls. So if you're focusing more on disabling services, tweaking the configuration, hardening the configuration, then you may not need to spend so much on your defensive costs, and you know that you get a definitive risk reduction outcome from it. So the extra cost of those extra costs that you might see from those resources is offset. But over time, this becomes part of your engineering discipline that you do before you roll things out into production. So over time, your domain skill sets could elevate to start to understand some of these technologies and approaches.
Yes.
One other thing I'll add as well is AI is a part of everything. So where I find it very useful is there's a need to kind of do lots of mappings between vulnerabilities and threats and so on. Large language models are a great tool for speeding things up in that regard and helping the process along. Kind of as as I use the co-pilot term, that it's a co-pilot to help you along your way. It doesn't do the threat modeling for you. It doesn't do threat assessment for you, but it's a great way of basically doing the mappings and speed things along a little bit. So that's part of the future around it. As well as there's some very emerging kind of like technology approaches to build threat modeling into CI/CD pipelines, for example. Things like threat spec, where you can put threat notations into code. PyTM is a Python-driven threat modeling approach as well for CI/CD pipeline. And there are many open source tools and methodologies emerging that fit into that space.
Barry, I absolutely love this, and I think we're definitely going to spin out a round table out of this thinking. But if I was just going to summarize this whole conversation came out of you and I collaborating, but also out of my last article on constraints. And I really relate to that. Constraint is a good way, but in some ways what you're saying is we have to deem what is important to us, and we need to really properly risk quantify, not guess. Don't accept blanket default, but the underlying thing to all of this is think.
Yeah.
We need to think it through.
I was just going to say, constraints don't limit security, they focus it. That's a key point.
Oh, that's good. I like that. They focus it. Brilliant. And on that note, I think we'll need to leave it there, but to be continued. And Perry, thank you very much indeed. This is a fascinating conversation. There is so much you clearly worked with this, and I admire.
I'm very passionate about the discipline. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you.